Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Sorry for the casual nature. It's in the morning and I just wrote up my notes for chapter 20 and I thought I would get this video done and get it posted. So excuse me if I'm a bit too casual. So chapter 20 is called The Three World Order, 1940 to 1975. And the reason it's called The Three World Order is because near the end of the chapter it talks about the first world, the second world, and the third world. And I'm not really sure that's the way I would have divided it up, but because there's so much going on in this time period, I think the historians who wrote the textbook really needed to come up with some sort of framework in which to organize what they wrote. So the bottom line is this chapter covers between 1940 and 1975, and I make a little quote in my reading notes. It's actually my own quote, that as a history professor, it's always depressing to read history that takes place after I was born. So this period of time between 1940 and 1975, I was born somewhere in that period of time. And if you guess my age exactly, you might even get extra credit. So we can talk about that. But you know, the last time we spoke and the last thing we read was about World War I and how we sort of went from this. And let's just talk about Europe for a minute. We sort of went from Europe that was still ruled really by monarchies, these kings, these rich families, the Habsburgs and Austria-Hungary and France, of course, was democratized at that point. But for the most part, Western Europe, and really I'm talking about Germany, Hungary, Austria, those areas, they looked nothing like they look today. So Western Europe was totally different. And World War I occurs because of different land grabs, for lack of a better term. So, you know, the borders of Russia, the borders of Austria-Hungary, the borders of France, these things are all in flux. And World War I occurs as a result of these border disputes and also because of imperialism, even by the Brits. You know, you remember that Africa was colonized, India was colonized. These were not independent states at that time. So World War I happened because all of this stuff was being sorted out. And, you know, land grabs in this case have a lot to do with resources. Who gets the natural resources? Who has the most power? If you remember, World War I didn't end well, at least for the Germans especially, and there were reparations, which were like fines, and the ideas of power and control and borders weren't quite worked out yet. And Africa and India are still colonized. Japan, if you remember, was into China, was starting to establish some control over China. And the USSR, well, actually, you know, Russia, this was the Russian Revolution we read about, you know, that politically and socially was all still being sorted out. So there was a lot going on. And World War II occurs because of the problems that were unresolved after World War I. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind. And I think that it would be easy to argue that a lot of the chapters that we've read up to this point really aren't too relevant for our lives today. I would argue that they all are in some way, but when we get to chapter 20, that's totally untrue because World War II happens in the 1940s, and as a result of World War II, the world we live in today, and just think of the world we live in today in terms of national borders, if nothing else. The world we live in today was formed after World War II. So modern Europe, if you will, Germany, France, modern Italy, modern Britain, the decolonization of Africa and India, really sort of modern Russia, but there's a lot there, are all formed after World War II. And the really important thing is, know that Israel did not exist prior to World War II as a separate country. So that's something we'll read about at the end when we read about Zionist, but it's really important because of all of the issues going on in the Middle East. That's one area that's really still in flux. And we read about Syria, and we read about ISIS, and we read about caliphates, and we read about Lebanon all the time. And these are still areas that are in flux. And I would argue, the same with Ukraine. Again, this Russian southern border is still a thing. So that's why this chapter is important, because during World War II, or World War II starts really because of German aggression and Japanese aggression, because they're still sort of flexing their muscle to gain dominance and to gain territory. And a lot of this is related to ethnicity and race. And it's a little bit different than the racial struggles that we have in the U.S. The Germans thought that Germans, blonde hair, blue eye, white people were superior, and the Japanese thought that the Japanese were superior. So a lot of this war comes about because of superiority in ethnicity, and also a grab for more power and more resources, especially in the case of Japan, which is definitely landlocked. So that's the main thing to keep in mind why the war started. Now, the war itself, there's a couple of maps, and I make a note of the maps in my reading notes. So there's a map on page 749, and there's also a map on 751. And so the 749 map shows the theater of war in Europe, and the 751 map shows the theater of war in Asia, in Japan. So look at those, because I think it gives you a feel for just how much was going on. I don't even think that we today can fathom what's going on. And both of these theaters of war are being fought simultaneously. So that's why it's World War, because it clearly was war on a global scale like no one had ever seen before. So, we could spend 2 semesters on World War II. We could spend a semester of World War II just in Europe. It's so complicated. But the bottom line is, since we run through decades in this class in a period of minutes, it was really bad. A lot of people died. And the Allied powers, which included the U.S. and England and France and a number of other countries, we come out victorious, and anytime there's a victor, it's great for the victor, but for the vanquished, for the loser, it's always bad, and there's always going to be continuing problems afterwards, because people are forced into countries or situations that they didn't choose. Now, also, it's the beginning of the Cold War after World War II, and the thing to understand about the Cold War is that after World War II, the two emerging superpowers are USSR, which is basically Russia, and the United States. And the Cold War really refers to this period of time after World War II that is sort of a nuclear standoff. So when the war ends, and let me back up a little bit. So the U.S. drops the first 2 nuclear bombs in Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and think about that for a second. So if you and I'm looking at my notes real quick. So if you look at Hiroshima, and I know a lot of you aren't from the Toledo area because this is distance ed, but if you are from Toledo, Hiroshima is like if you dropped a bomb in downtown Toledo, it would take out all of Sylvania, all of Perrysburg, all of Oregon, this whole area up to Monroe, Michigan. So, really a 10 or 12 mile radius would be completely flattened. And the other thing to think about, because I think it's relative, and I'm going to go back to Toledo again, but most of you can extrapolate if you live somewhere else. So in the Toledo metro area, including all of the suburbs, all around Lucas County, Wood County, Monroe County, there's about 380,000 people. So, or 380, 350, somewhere in there. And Hiroshima was about the exact same size. So when the bomb drops, 180,000 people die immediately. So I think you can get a feel for if more than half of the population in Northwest Ohio, Southeast Michigan would die, it's unimaginable consequences. So keep that in mind. And the other thing you should keep in mind about World War II is that again, we can't imagine our home in Sylvania or our home in Toledo being bombed out and having nowhere to go. I mean, no Kroger to go to, no car to drive. And so when you think about people in Europe, especially people in Germany and in some areas of France and the bombing in London, that's what's going on. So for us, we're all kind of spoiled rotten. Our biggest thing is whether our iPhones are going to work or not, and their biggest thing is survival. And this situation is still the case in the Middle East today. We all see the refugees and how desperate those situations are. And I just think that we should take some sort of appreciation for how bad things can be and be grateful for what we have every day. So I'll stop there and get back into the history. The World War II itself, the Red Army, which is the Russian army, loses an incredible number of soldiers. They're on our side, and the Red Army is critical as far as an Allied victory in World War II. And sometimes I think that as Americans, we think, hey, America won the war, but you have to understand that the Red Army was instrumental also. I don't want to go too long with this video, but I have a lot to say because this history, this chapter really affects my own life. Not only am I born during this period of time, but my father was drafted between his junior and senior year of high school to go fight in Europe, to be a tank driver. So again, think about this. Many of you are high school students that are taking this class. Many of you are seniors. Think about being drafted between your junior and senior year to go fight in Europe, which I call is like a 2-year really bad camping trip while people are trying to kill you the whole time. And you can laugh about that, but that's really what it's all about. So think about that and appreciate the veterans of World War II and also the victims of World War II. When the war ends, there's really this division of power, spheres of influence, and the USSR, Russia, and the communists are one sphere of influence, and the United States and the West, NATO, really, the Western European countries are the other sphere of influence. And because even though Russians and the U.S. were allies in World War II, after World War II, we kind of take control of the world because we are the two who really defeated the Japanese and defeated the Nazis, Nazi Germany at the time. So there's this big power grab, and that's really the beginning of the Cold War in 48, 49. And really the Cold War was really a nuclear standoff, if you will. And I talked about the atomic bombs. The U.S. were the first to invent and use atomic bombs, but Russia certainly had their own nuclear arsenal built up by the end of the 40s. So then there was this standoff. If you remember what imperialism was, these countries that try to grab territory, the spheres of influence after World War II are kind of like that, and they're really not only physical grabbing of territory, but really ideological grabs of territory, because there's sort of two different structures of society and economies that still exist today. And these structures become clear after World War II. So, we live in a very liberal, small L liberal, democracy run by capitalism, where there are free elections and free press. The cornerstones of our Constitution really dictate how our country is run and how a lot of the Western world is run as well. Even now. So, a country like Japan even is very similar to our country as far as politics and the economy is concerned. On the other side, the Eastern Bloc countries, so you're going to see a map in your textbook somewhere that shows the Warsaw Pact and the NATO countries. This group of Warsaw Pact countries, the communists, live in a world where there are free elections, but they're really driven by one political party, the communists. So they're really not free elections the way that we know them. And the economy is command and control. The government either owns the means of production, in other words, the government owns the businesses, or at least the government dictates what businesses do. The other big thing, and this goes all the way back to our first discussion on Gutenberg and the press and the importance of information, is that in communist countries there is no freedom of the press. So if the government controls the press, the government controls the messages that the people receive. So in essence, all of the news is fake news, as Trump would say, and there is no freedom of the press. And I think that that's a distinction that doesn't get enough attention, because whoever controls the message really controls the hearts and minds of the people. So keep that in mind. This Cold War is a really big deal. and even in the Western Hemisphere. So I don't think we talked about the Monroe Doctrine in here, but Cuba was, and is still a communist country, and so the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, it'll talk about that in the book. This is going on around the time I'm born. There's a space race in order to dominate space between the Russians and the U.S. So the Cold War was a really big deal. It ends in 1989. The Berlin Wall falls under Ronald Reagan, and at the end of this chapter there's some terms you need to know. So the Berlin Wall is one of them. You need to know what that means. Basically, after World War II, Germany was divided between West and East Germany, and the Berlin Wall ran right through the center of downtown Berlin, and it was a dividing line between sort of the Soviet sphere of influence and the Western or U.S. sphere of influence. So know that. Also know that the United Nations was formed after World War II in an effort to bring everyone to one table, and really the United Nations was critical to preventing World War III, at least hopefully. And also NATO is formed, so that's a pact between countries where if one country is attacked, everyone else will come to their allies' rescue. So, if someone beats you up on the playground and takes your lunch money, your buddies, your NATO buddies, will come and help you out. So NATO is really important, and I'm making this video on January 20th, 2019, and our president, Donald Trump, is talking about pulling out of NATO. And the reason it's so controversial is because NATO, this alliance, has really kept Europe and kept a good part of the world from dissolving again and getting back into these spats that cause world wars. So understand that, because it's really relevant to the news today. There's a lot of information in the book about decolonization, so Africa and India becoming independent during this period of time. That's important, but the one thing I really want you to pay attention to is page 764, because it talks about Palestine and Israel and Egypt, and you really need to know this stuff because, as you know, the Middle East is still in flux. There is a group of Jews, Zionists, that are lobbying to the UN and to the Allies that they should have their own homeland in Palestine, which is Arabic or an Arab area, and Israel is formed in the 40s as a brand new country. And the issue is that this is the Holy Land for Jews and for Arabs and for Muslims. So these battles are going to continue. I think for most of us living comfortably in the U.S. right now, it's hard for us to imagine, wanting to kill someone because they don't believe the same thing you do as far as religion is concerned. It's amazing in that standpoint how well we get along here in the United States. But read that section that starts on 764, because I want you to know why there's controversy with Israel and Palestine. And the bottom line is, where the Palestinian borders are in Israel, people get along on an intrinsic scale. Okay, so there are definitely Arabs and Jews that get along fine in that area, that perhaps work together or see each other every day. But this is all really political stuff. And, Israel has all kinds of weapons and nuclear weapons, and Iraq and Iran, they hate Israel. They don't feel that they have a right to be there. So this stuff is ongoing and could possibly be the scene of the next big war. And let's hope not. But as you read the news, you know that the U.S. is a close ally with Israel, and this is an ongoing controversy. So enough about that. Make sure you read it. Also, there's some key words in the back of the chapter. You should know all these, but you definitely should know what the Holocaust is. That's the Germans taking Jews to concentration camps and gassing entire families. Imagine that you're taken out of your home for your religion, and your family is killed or tortured, or both. So, think about that. You should know a little bit about Japanese internment in the United States. I don't have time to cover it on this video, but read about it in the book. Know what it is. I want you to know what the Berlin Wall was. I want you to know why the Korean War was fought, and understand that we still have North Korea and South Korea. That's a direct result of this idea of communism versus a more liberal democratic social structure. So there's a lot here. I'm sorry this video is so long, but it's really important. And if you have any questions, let me know. Keep up the good work. Thanks a lot. You guys are all doing great. Have a great day. Bye-bye.